Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. You are welcome to this first in the second part of the energy policy and planning course. As you know, this course is being mounted as part of our MSc Renewable Energy Technologies offered by e-learning, and the course has been taught by Professor Coulibaly and myself. Professor Coulibaly has done the first part, and I'm going to be doing the second part. So today's session is on energy economics, pricing, and regulatory as well as institutional frameworks. I have broken the presentation into three. That's the basic economics and applications to energy, where we will cover some of the basic economic concepts of supply and demand curves, price and income elasticity, as well as project financial analysis. And as I will say now, for many of you in this class, the project financial analysis is probably what you're going to be using the most, because you will be looking at either renewable energy project implementation or development and analysis, or you'll be looking using the same concepts to look at conventional energy projects and their financial analysis. The second part of the presentation will look at energy pricing, and then basically what we will do is look at how world energy prices have changed over the years, and then go on to look at domestic energy pricing and what are some of the factors influencing domestic energy pricing. The last part of the presentation would look at energy sector regulation and institutional frameworks. The first question really we will tackle will be the question of regulation versus deregulation. This is a debate in many countries and in many sectors. Sometimes in the same country you will have different regulatory regimes prevailing in one sector versus the other. One sector might very well be deregulated, whilst another sector in the same country would be quite heavily regulated. So it's a continuing debate that we will always have with us, but we'll look at some of the issues there. And then lastly, we will look at institutional frameworks and how they impact on energy policy, generally speaking. So let's start off with the basic economics and the applications to energy. Now, the basic tool that economists use is the supply and demand curves. The supply curve, as you can see, is one that starts close to the origin and sort of extends as you go into higher levels of quantity and price. Similarly, you have a demand curve that starts from, nearer infinity, if you like, on the y-axis, and also curves downwards, approaching zero as you go to higher levels of the quantity. What these curves show is how supply regimes vary between price or cost and quantity. And the supply curve in particular shows that when you are taking a small amount of a particular product, now it's easier to get low cost producers coming in and providing the product. Now, as you demand more, higher cost producers also come into the market, and generally they produce at a higher price. So the lower cost producers can reap advantages by selling at a higher cost, because there are higher cost producers in the market, and that's why the curve is oriented like that. In the case of the demand curve, it's practically the opposite, because the fewer the people in the market, usually the more they can afford to pay, and therefore the price generally is high. But as you get more and more people coming to the market, you get people with lower purchasing power, lower ability to pay, and therefore at the higher levels of Q you have lower price on the demand curve. Now, where the two curves meet is the equilibrium point, and that's the market clearing price. That's where you have just about the exact number of people willing to pay a certain price for a good that is produced at that price, and therefore people are willing to sell at that price. That's the market clearing price. Now, this has implications, because for those who are producing the good or service at lower than the market clearing price, they have a surplus. They have a profit, if you like, because they're producing cheaper than what they're selling for. And the economists call the region to the left of the graph between the market clearing price and the supply curve as the producer surplus, because that's a surplus that's available to the producer to do whatever he likes with. And similarly, the region to the left of the demand curve and above the market clearing price is the consumer surplus, because those consumers on that portion of the demand curve are willing to pay higher, but because the market clears at the lower price, they pay the lower price, and so there's a certain differential which they keep to themselves, and they can use for whatever they like, to buy something else or to save or do something else. So that consumer surplus is also important for policy purposes, because you might want to eat into the consumer surplus or the producer surplus, or vice versa, and that's something that policymakers usually take into account. But then over time, both in the short term and the long term, you can have shifts in the supply and the demand curves. A shift in the supply curve can come, for instance, if an additional if income taxes are raised, for instance, across the board, then even for low-cost producers as well as high-cost producers, they're going to have to pay higher income taxes, and therefore their cost of production is going to go higher. Same for maybe telecommunications. If some of the services like telecommunications, electricity, and so on are increased, then that cuts across all suppliers. Even if they are producing solar panels or producing wind turbines, the costs are going to go up across the board, and your supply curve is going to go up. Similarly, your demand curve can go up, and there are again several reasons why the demand curve can go up. If there's, say, a salary increase, a national general salary increase, then consumers have more money in their pockets, and they are willing to pay more. Both poorer as well as richer consumers generally have more money, so that leads to a shift in the demand curve. I mean, over time, in the long term, also as the economy grows and the average income increases, then people have more money and can afford to pay more over time, and therefore the demand curve also shifts. Now, this then causes a change in the market clearing value, depending on whether it's a supply curve that is shifting or the demand curve that is shifting, as shown in the two graphs. That leads then on to another concept that is of extreme importance in economics and energy economics as well, which is the elasticity of demand. Now, elasticity of demand is a function, reflects the extent to which small changes in price affect the quantity demanded of a good. Okay, so where the good is very elastic, a small change in the price leads to a large change in the quantity demanded. Now, if it's inelastic, then you're going to need a large increase in or decrease in price to increase the quantity of the good demanded. And various goods, including energy goods and services, lend themselves to high elasticity or low elasticity. If you take petroleum, for instance, I mean, when petroleum prices are increased, initially people grumble, but they pay. They have to go to work. They have to pay, for transportation and so on, and they will do that. But in the long term, they will adjust to it, because it's not something they can sustain, over a longer period. But then also, if you look at, say, LPG, usually if you increase the cost of LPG, what people then do is they start switching. So you could end up with a fairly large elastic demand for LPG, because there are immediate substitutes that people can go to, like charcoal, firewood, kerosene. There's a lot of substitute for LPG. So LPG would tend to be an elastic, energy product or fuel with an elastic demand, whereas petrol, at least in the short term, will tend to be petroleum products like petrol and liquid transportation fuels will tend to be inelastic, at the very least in the short term. So that leads again to a distinction between long run elasticity of demand and short run elasticity of demand. One would come into play over a longer period, whereas the other would come into play over a shorter period. And of course, the elasticity of the demand will determine the extent to which the quantity demanded changes when, let's say, the supply curve shifts, and therefore the market clearing value shifts. If the demand is highly elastic, then you would need very significant changes in the supply curve to cause a significant change in the quantity demanded. But in the longer term, you could have a much bigger change in the supply curve, and then if you have a fairly elastic demand, you could get high change in the quantity of the good, demanded, or the number of people patronizing a particular good. So if we go on then, now these same principles are then applied in the area of project financial analysis, and as I said earlier, that's probably what most of us are going to be doing a lot more of the time, because of the kinds of interest and activities that we are engaged in, trying to develop a project, trying to implement a renewable energy project, or sometimes even for some of you, a conventional energy project. Now, the project financial analysis is done to assess the financial viability and profitability of projects in terms of their costs, and their benefits. Now, generally speaking, a project is said to be profitable if the benefits exceed the costs. Now, if the costs exceed the benefits, then you don't want to put your money into that, because you're going to lose that money. So you need some indicators to measure this. Now, the three indicators that are very common in the industry or in the sector are net present value, also known as NPV, internal rate of return, IRR, and payback period. Well, some people might say PP, but you don't really find that. It's usually just payback period. Now, net present value, there are definitions here. The net present value is the sum of all the discounted after-tax cash flows of a project over a specific period of time. So basically, if you take a given project, say you want to implement a wind power project. Now, the wind turbine would normally last for, let's say, 25 years, after which you would need to replace generator. You'd need to do a complete overhaul. So you would give it a lifetime of 25 years. Now, over that 25 years, you're going to look at what your life cycle costs are. In other words, you first will start with an investment. Every year there will be some operation and maintenance cost, and then you would also have some replacement parts. Maybe some bearings will have to be replaced let's say every 5 years. Okay, and some startup mechanisms might need to be replaced every 10 years and things like that. So all of those are costs which you have to then look at over the lifetime of the project. Then you do the same for your benefits. In terms of your benefits, it's essentially the revenue that you get from selling electricity. So you would have, if you assume that your wind turbine produces a constant amount of power every year, a constant amount of energy every year, then you can put a price on it. And assuming that the tariff does not increase over time, then you can calculate what your revenue is for the 25 or so years lifetime of the wind turbine. And you compare the two. Now, because of inflation and because of time value of money, I mean, when I have 10 Ghana cedis or 10 ECOWAS currency units in my pocket today, it's worth more to me than 10 ECOWAS currency units in 10 years' time. Discount factors are used to bring future payments, to the present by discounting them and reducing them, as to using a discount factor which is linked to what the investor or the analyst perceives to be the time value of money, and that is also usually linked to interest rates and also to inflation. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's what the investor or the project developer perceives to be the value, the time value of money. So you can use that discount factor to discount all your payments to the present, and then you compare your total costs and your total benefits to get your net present value of benefits. If it's positive, then you have a positive benefit. Project is viable. If it's negative, you have then more costs, higher costs than benefits, and therefore the project is really not financially viable. So anyway, net present value is used quite a lot in to analyze energy projects and renewable energy projects as well. Then there's the internal rate of return. Now this is the discount rate at which the NPV of a project is zero. Because remember, you want the project to have a positive NPV, but you want to know what discount rate is the limit, below which your project will just not be viable. So the discount rate that is equal to zero is the one that you're looking for. The discount rate that makes the NPV zero is what you're looking for. What it means then is that if your project has a an internal rate of return that is higher than that discount factor, it means you can expect greater returns on your investment. Okay, if it's lower, then not so much. So that discount rate that you choose becomes a cutoff point for determining whether your project is viable or not, if your internal rate of return is higher than that discount rate. Then same for payback period. Payback period is the simplest of the three indicators, because there basically you're looking at you're comparing your revenues with costs, and the idea is to determine the length of time required to recoup your initial investment. So if your initial investment is 1,000 ECOWAS currency units, and your revenue, and let's say that's all, you don't have any, your operating and maintenance costs are negative, not negative, are zero, minimal, let's say zero for purposes of calculation. Then all you're looking for now are your revenues, and if you have revenues of, let's say, 2,000 ECOWAS currency units a year, then you would pay for your project in 5 years. Okay, and so then it's up to you to decide whether 5 years is good enough to pay back your project in, or whether you would like to do that in a shorter time. 5 years is usually good for most people, up to approaching 10 years for larger projects. But beyond 10 years, people get very worried and would need a lot of guarantees and a lot of factors to make them invest in a project. So those three parameters, net present value, NPV, internal rate of return, IRR, and payback period, tend to be used a lot for analyzing projects. Payback period is good for simple projects, where most of your investment is in the first year, and subsequently you really don't have significant investment. So all that is coming in is revenue, and you can simply calculate the payback period. But for projects that are a little bit more complicated, where maybe 2 or 3 times in the course of the lifetime you have to make significant investments, then payback period is not very good, because you have to discount your investment in year 10 and in year 20 to year 1 and add that to the cost, and then you have to discount also your revenue. So depending on the discount factor that you use, it will not. Some people don't really consider that good enough, payback period good enough for comparing projects like that, because you have additional expenditures, additional major expenditures in the lifetime of the project. For those kinds of projects, then internal rate of return or net present value are much better indicators, because of the complicated, or not so simple nature of the flows of cash in the project. But generally, all three indicators tend to be used a lot for project analysis. So then let's look at energy pricing, because again, the supply and demand curves that we looked at, the project financing in terms of the cost of project, whether you make a profit or not, all of these then go to influence the way in which energy is priced for different commodities, for different energy products, and in different parts of the world, different countries. Now, if we look globally at the world crude oil production, and we look at the trends by region, we see, well, at the bottom there is OECD, followed by Middle East, which is where the bulk of the oil reserves are at this point in time. And you can see the trend, increasing, since the 1970s, marginally, but on the whole, not that large a set of increase, and tending to slow down a bit as you approach 2010. Africa also has, is very much in the game. There's a good number of African countries that are producing oil, and there are new finds coming up. Ghana recently joined oil producing countries. There's Sierra Leone and Liberia that are lined up, also to become oil producers, shortly. So Africa is an active player, but there are issues here of peak oil. This graph doesn't show it well enough, but there's quite a hot debate about whether global oil production has peaked or not. I mean, there's a sizable community that asserts and can show with various graphs that global oil production indeed has peaked and is now on the downhill. But there are others also who believe that whatever peaks people have observed are really temporary peaks, and that new oil fields are being found all the time, and that is going to take another decade or two before oil production actually peaks. So the jury is still out there. Debate is on as to whether oil production has peaked or not. But all of this has implications on the price. as oil resources get scarcer and oil production gets tighter, you're going into more expensive, oil fields. The cheaper oil fields are developed first, so you are climbing up the supply curve and getting into higher cost supply, higher cost segments of the supply curve. And as you can see, over time, the oil price has been going up. It was quite, relatively speaking, low in the 80s and the 90s, but picked up, considerably from about 2001, and has been rising with quite a lot of fluctuation, usually determined, by the market players, because as they perceive global crisis or they perceive regional wars or instabilities, that tends to influence the price which they are able to, they offer on the oil markets, and hence some of the very deep swings. But in terms of the reserves and the supply curve, I mean, that change is more gradual than this price curve would tend to show. So the reserves influence price, but probably more importantly is the prospectus, the markets that are looking to a number of other geopolitical factors to determine the actual price offered on the market. Now, if we look at world electricity generation, also by fuel, now there we see again that fossil fuel, contributes the largest to electricity. So you can see how electricity prices would be coupled very closely to the price of oil, because oil plays such a big role in the production of electricity, followed by nuclear and hydro, and then other, which includes some biomass, but also solar, and wind. Now, if we then go on to look at what are the factors affecting domestic electricity pricing, number one, as I've said already at the global level, is the type and the cost of fuel used for electricity generation. If you're using a lot more fossil fuel, then your price is going to be higher, because fossil fuels by definition are more expensive than hydro, largely by hydro. Renewables are a different kettle of fish, but between fossil fuels and hydro, of course there's also nuclear, but nuclear is a tricky one, because nuclear has often benefited from significant government subsidies over and above some of the conventional fuels. And nuclear also has some costs that are often not factored into the equation, like the decommissioning costs of nuclear reactors, which are known to be quite high, the waste disposal costs, and then of course there's the factors that you cannot even price financially, which is the risk of proliferation and issues around that. But anyway, the fact that oil plays an important role in global oil power production, and also at national level, depending on the generation mix, would influence the price of electricity. The type of consumer is also important, whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial. And these usually there are two factors there. One is the fact that because residential consumers are usually consuming relatively small amounts of electricity compared to industry, it is more expensive to supply the individual residential consumer as opposed to the individual industrial consumer. But ultimately it boils down to government policy, because governments decide whether they're going to subsidize industrial consumers so that they can hopefully generate more employment, or whether they're going to subsidize the residential consumers, so you have peace at the level of industrial unions and things like that. So at the end of the day, that's a government policy, and many countries favor favor industry not being overburdened at the level of electricity pricing, so that in principle they can generate more employment and hopefully more revenue, more incomes into the economy. A third factor is the time of electricity consumption. Here, for many industrialized countries, there are time of use tariffs, so that if you use electricity during the peak season, during the peak period, when more expensive plants have been brought online, then the tariff is going to be higher to reflect that. If you use it during the off-peak periods, when you're running on base load, and base load is the cheapest plants usually in your system, then your tariff is lower. So time of use can also be used, one, to reflect the actual cost of production, but also to send a signal to people to shift from higher cost peak power to lower cost base load power. Now, then at the end of the day, it's government and industry regulations as well as the subsidies that derive from these regulations and policies. Because as I said earlier, government decides whether they want to cross-subsidize and whether they want to cross-subsidize from industry to residential or from residential to industry. That's a choice that governments make. And they live with the consequences, as indeed we are in this part of the world. So if we come again further down to Ghana, we can see what the generation costs are from the Strategic National Energy Plan that was prepared for Ghana, finalized in 2004. You can see the costs go from just about 2 cents per kilowatt hour for the large Akosombo hydro power plant. It was 912 megawatts initially, but then retrofitted and the capacity increased to 1020 megawatts. So the price goes up from there all the way through the Bui power plant. At the time this was done, Bui was expected to cost in the region of 7-8 cents per kilowatt hour, but as we speak now, the expected cost is going to be higher for various reasons, inflation not excluded. And then this rises all the way up to solar PV, where for a 50 kilowatt solar PV system, the price as at 2004 was estimated to be 30 US cents per kilowatt hour. Now, so this is somewhat akin to the supply curve that I showed earlier, in this case for power generation. And you can see you're going from, as I said, lower cost producers to higher cost producers. And depending on where your demand curve lies, you would end up paying more or less for electricity. Now, in this particular case, if we look at the end user tariff, we can see the end user tariff is higher than most of the thermals, than all the thermals, apart from small generators, and then also, of course, apart from solar PV. And then you can see the bulk supply tariff, which is really a kind of an average production cost between the thermals and the hydro. But it all goes to show how one needs to be very careful in setting these tariffs, because you must reflect the cost. Otherwise, you basically are running your utilities down if they have to sell at the tariffs that are well below their costs. Somebody has to pay for it. Either they let maintenance go, or they let repairs, they sacrifice repairs, or you just don't get new plant. Okay, and then that leads to load shedding and constraints on the system as a whole. So it's really important that these tariffs are set. These prices are set to reflect the costs of the actual generation plants in the country. This chart shows how the bulk supply tariff has evolved between 1998 and 2003. And how that compares with the actual cost of production. I mean, for a long time in this country, between 1999 and 2003, we were paying on the bulk supply tariff less than it actually cost to produce the electricity. I mean, that was no good for the utilities. We will need to update this to see what the situation is now. But quite clearly, PURC is setting tariffs now that they believe reflect costs. And an independent assessor would need to check this. And let us know what they think. Here's another trend for the end user tariff. In this case, as you can see, it went down considerably in 2000, and then has been rising consistently since then up to 2006. Again, this will have to be updated for us to see where we stand at the moment. So what are the factors affecting domestic petroleum pricing? I mean, here you're saying that international crude oil prices would be number one, but then also there will be the international demand and supply balances of petroleum products. I mean, I mentioned elsewhere that you have the emerging economies, large emerging economies like China and India, whose demand for fossil fuels is just growing. I mean, growing and growing. So that has an impact on the global oil price, which then feeds back eventually into our domestic pricing. So that international supply demand situation is really very important. Then, of course, at the national level, you're talking about the exchange rate, or whatever your exchange rate, policies are. What margins are put on top for, like, transportation, for distribution, for retail, for regulation. There are usually margins that are put on, and not so much for regulation, but more for the direct players in the value chain. Okay. And then, of course, you have domestic costs, including transportation costs, which are often reflected in the margins, as in the case of Ghana. And then taxes and levies, which are how governments raise revenue for specific applications. I mean, in Ghana, it's been for rural electrification, it's been for the promotion of renewable energy. We've used levies to do this. And of course, taxes have always been there to raise revenue generally, for government. So these are, if you like, the key factors that influence the petroleum pricing, at the domestic level. Now, if we now go on to look at the energy sector regulation and institutional frameworks, and as I said, let's start off by looking at deregulation now and how it is seen by different people. I mean, deregulation was defined simply by Armstrong, Cohen, and Vickers as the removal of regulation. As simple as that. That if you have a sector that has regulation, government says you can only sell at this price. Government says you can only run this kind of power plant. You cannot run nuclear, and you cannot run maybe coal. Now, if then government now decides to remove that regulation, then the power companies are able to look at a wider range of fuels and decide which ones to implement based on their bottom line, which is the financial analysis that we spoke about earlier. Then the Collins Dictionary simply defines deregulation as the removal of controls over economic activity which have been imposed by the government or some other regulatory body. So it's just putting more meat to the Armstrong and others' definition of removal of regulation, but this time just saying clearly that removing controls over economic activity. Then Patterson also says that the deregulation really is liberalization, and it's the removal of restrictions on competition, opening up of competition, relaxing government's grip on the industry or the sector. Okay, so deregulation means opening it up so more people can come in, more players can come. I know for many countries, both the petroleum and the electricity sectors were regulated and almost restricted to state-owned companies. Now, over time, these restrictions have been removed so that private operators can come into both the power, electricity side of the industry, as well as the petroleum, and some crude oil imports side of the industry. But this has taken some time to evolve. Certainly in our own Ghana, in my own Ghana, and I know in many other African countries. Now, so further examples of deregulation would be the removal of price controls, increase in supplier access to markets, providing consumers with wider access to supplies and supplies. As I said, if you take crude, now you have different people coming in or even LPG. I mean, the past Tema Oil Refinery in Ghana was the only one that produced and sold and supplied LPG on the market. But now you've got private people bringing in the LPG, and of course, and other fuels. Now, California is the classic example of deregulation gone bad, because California really went all out to deregulate its power sector and didn't pay enough attention to ensuring that things like reserve margin, loss of failure probabilities had been well taken care of. So in the end, what happened? There was a major failure in California. They had to resort to load shedding in one of the biggest economies in the world, and that really was not good for deregulation. But it's just that it was pushed so far out there that the results really backfired in their faces. So if we now turn finally really to the institutional framework. Now, what the slide seeks to show is that we tend when we're looking at institutional frameworks for the energy sector, we tend to focus on just the energy sector agencies. You know, the Ministry of Energy, the Energy Commission, Public Utilities Regulatory Commission. And we look at the companies, the electricity companies or the oil marketing companies, oil, refining, companies. And we think that's it. But there are many other players that influence the development of the energy sector. Not least of which are lawmakers, the courts, and the security agencies. The lawmakers, they pass the laws. So it's important that they are well informed. So they pass laws that would augur well for the development of the sector. Same for the courts. I mean, if you have a grievance and you want to take a company on or take an institution on, it's the courts that are going to that you're going to go to. And if they don't function properly, then that undermines your confidence in the energy companies, which then has a ripple effect on to the extent to which you are even willing to pay your bills and things like that. Then there are a range of consultants, R&D institutions, other educational training institutions, local financial institutions. I mean, they have a critical role to play on the consumer end in terms of financing consumer products, microfinance, lease financing, all of those kinds of things that enable consumers to pay for energy and energy services. And then, of course, I did mention already policy-making institutions and local government, because they are the ones who are also setting the policies, and overseeing the development of the sector as a whole. Now, another way of looking at the companies that are actually involved in the delivery of the service, the direct delivery of the service, is to look at the way in which the income profiles are shaped in a typical developing country. I mean, first of all, there's a dichotomy or distinction between rural and urban areas, and the income curves show in rural areas usually large numbers of people living below the poverty line. I mean, if you take $1 a day as the poverty line in a typical rural area in Africa, you'd have 70% of the people living below $1 a day, 60, 70, sometimes 80% living below $1 a day. In the urban areas, it's lower. The national average might be maybe 40, as in Ghana. It used to be recently 40% or so national average. But that would mean some 60, 70% poverty in the rural areas and maybe 20, 30% in the urban areas. Now, the utilities and the large energy companies are usually able to serve the higher segments of the urban market, and a little bit of the rural market, again, much higher segments of the rural market. But as you go into the lower income levels, it's the SMEs, small and medium enterprises. As you go even further, micro enterprises. I remember as a kid, that people used to sell kerosene in small bottles on their head. It was micro enterprise at that level, if you can even call it that. And in real rural areas, it's community-based organizations that get together and organize some of decentralized energy system or off-grid system of some sort. So it's important to look at these income profiles as well, and to recognize that the different kinds of energy sector or energy service providers perform probably better in some particular segments of the market. I mean, you wouldn't take community-based organizations to the heart of the city, because it just doesn't really work like that. The utilities are there to provide that service. So one needs to look at this in the broader context when one is looking at energy sector institutions and agencies. Now, if we again look at Ghana and the power sector, how it's evolved, the left chart shows how until 5 years ago or so, I mean, the transmission system, was together with the hydro and the thermal generation systems in VRA. So VRA had both the generation, the majority of the generation, the transmission, and then also they had the Northern Electricity Distribution Department. So VRA was in that sense, vertically integrated all the way down to distribution in the north. Then there was the ECG and the bulk customers, as well as low voltage customers. But over time now, this has changed. Now, GridCo, the transmission system, is no longer part of VRA, Even the Northern Electricity Distribution Company is in the process, but has been set up now as a distinct subsidiary within VRE. And there's a lot more independent power producers, who are in the system. There's TICO, there is Sunon Asogli, and there's several that are in the works. Senpower is one of them. Plus, there are renewable power companies that are gearing up to come on board now that the renewable energy law in Ghana has been passed. So that power sector has changed considerably in Ghana, where one can see an advance of reform, gradual as it may be, but an advance in the reform process. And at the consumer and distribution end, you have a regulated market as well as a deregulated market. The regulated market is for less than 5 megawatt scale consumers, and those who are large consumers can opt to go into the deregulated market, and they can negotiate directly with the power producers, either with the IPPs or with the VRAs, to get their power sold through the grid. But the regulated market they go by prices that are set by the Public Utilities Regulatory Agency. Now, this really brings us to the fact that one needs to look broadly, as I said, at the whole institutional framework. And even though we're not going to be talking about media and so on, it's important to note that even in the energy sector, you have not-for-profit companies like Energy Foundation, New Energy, Kite, and then you have university institutions like my own Energy Center, where we're doing various studies, various research projects that have an impact on the mainstream electricity sector. So it's important to look at these other agencies and what they're doing. For us, also in Ghana and in West Africa, we need to look at our regional sector, regional market. And now we have the West African Power Pool that is looking to grow the West African power market. And then there's the West African Gas Pipeline Company that's bringing in gas from Nigeria to Benin, Togo, and Ghana. And then there is ECOWAS has set up the ECOWAS Regional Agency for Electricity Regulation. ERERA is the acronym that ECOWAS has given to this organization. And the aim of this organization is to regulate inter-country electricity sales and electricity exports, imports between the different countries, and also to set some standards that would guide the industry as a whole and try and unify the market and bring more competition at the regional level, which ultimately should benefit the consumer, because you get hopefully more lower cost producers coming up. Remember again the supply curve. The bigger your market, the more likely you are to get lower cost producers as well as higher cost producers, but that extends your supply curve and it gives you more flexibility in terms of pricing and energy policy interventions. Okay then, so that brings us to the end of this first presentation. There are two exercises that I'd like to leave you with. First one is for you to download the Red Screen software and use it to analyze the technical performance and economics of a 4 kilowatt grid connected solar PV system. Red Screen, you can just type Red Screen in Google, and that will take you to the Red Screen site. You can download the latest version of the software, and then using your local prices, whichever country you are in, prices for PV, cost for feasibility studies, installation, anything that requires costing, use your local cost, and assume a 20-year project lifetime for this 4 kilowatt grid connected system. And with that, then calculate the payback period, the internal rate of return, and net present value. We will have a tutorial class on this in the next class, and we will discuss what your initial findings are. The second exercise that I want you to do would be something that you should do in groups. Now, I want you to do a comparative analysis of the long-term historical production cost and market price trends for the following products, for crude oil, for solar PV, for wind turbines, and also for nuclear power plant. Now, the idea is for you to do this in groups, between 4 and 5 people. Now, everybody must join some group, so please, if you need assistance, get in touch with with us, the instructors, and with the facilitator, Dr. Gabriel Techi, by email, so we can assist you and get into a group. Now, I will arrange a time where each group will then make a presentation. From wherever you are across the internet, you would need to synchronize to do this presentation. And of course, marks would be awarded for that. So thank you very much, and now let's hear if you have any questions or comments or queries. Thank you very much.